Hey everybody, welcome back to the Making Space podcast. Of course, as you've been journeying along with us, this podcast is intended to help us as leaders and those who are helping others follow Jesus think deeply about the influence of physical spaces, both in and outside of our churches, and how they impact and form our emotions, our thoughts, our behavior, our spiritual lives. I am one of your co-hosts, Jay Kim, and as always, here with my dear friend from down under, Benjamin Wendell. Benjamin, how are you, man? It's good to see you.
I'm doing good, Jay, and I feel like I should say g'day, mate, to you. You know, we're at that point in our relationship now.
We're mates. We're now mates. Is it offensive? Is it offensive if a non-Australian? I have a friend actually who's from Texas.
I'm offended at you right now.
Are we allowed to use mates? Like, can I say you're my mate?
I'm offended in advance for what you're about to say. No, you and your buddy are not mates. If he's not Australian, then no. It's like the stealing of our phrase, no worries. Hey, that's ours. You guys have got enough things, right? You guys have got enough things. That phrase has
been stolen. Yeah, no worries has absolutely been stolen. Californians say it all the time. So my apologies on behalf of the state of California.
Yeah. Man, it's great to see you, and I've been enjoying our time together and these conversations, and I know today we've got a great conversation. Hey, for those that are new to this series of conversations we've been having as a podcast, I love the research that Aspen did with Barna around physical spaces. And Jay, I mean, for me, just having these talks has made me in my own life just see spaces and buildings and places through a different lens. It has awakened an awareness within me. And that's at the heart of what we've been talking about in this season. And so for yourself, however you are involved, be that ministry, business, different kinds of work in terms of physical spaces, then this is for you. And I think it'll be super helpful to you. Quick reminder that journal number 1, Making Space for Inspiration. Okay, this is the Barna and Aspen journal. It's available now, and you can go to barna.com/making space, or it's available to you if you are a Barna Plus subscriber. Now, Jay, hey, going back to the Australia thing, I feel like maybe some listeners were like, we just want to hear American accents for one podcast. So we're giving you all your wish. And Jay flies solo on what is a fantastic conversation with Daniel Yang. Jay, tell us about it.
Yeah, well, we missed you for that conversation. You were out of country, actually. I had a chance to sit down and chat with Daniel Yang. Many of you are familiar with him. If you're not, he is the director of Church Multiplication Institute at Wheaton College, Billy Graham Center. And prior to that, he planted a church in Toronto and has spent years training church planters through both the Send Network and the Release Initiative. He served on staff at a variety of churches, and he is passionate about the local church and passionate about the local church continuing to move the mission of God's kingdom forward. And so it was an incredible conversation. He's got such deep insight and wisdom. So we think you're going to gain a lot. So here is our conversation with Daniel Yang. Daniel, thanks so much for being on with us. It's a joy to talk to you. You know, I know a lot of our listeners are familiar with you and some of your work. But, you know, for those who aren't, tell us a bit about yourself, maybe your journey specific to church planting.
Yeah, Jay, first, thanks for having me on. I direct the Church Multiplication Institute at the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center. And what that is it's a think tank for church planting in North America. So I work with church planting leaders, convening them for best practices, and then really to kind of think about how do we plant churches better towards the future, what kinds of churches, those kinds of things. But, you know, by way of a short bio, from Detroit originally, was an engineer for 8-9 years, ended up in vocational ministry sort of by accident, planted some churches, and then came to Chicago to start a PhD, where a friend and mentor of mine, Ed Setzer, asked if I would consider starting the institute at the Graham Center. And so that was about 5.5 years ago. I've been here for about 5.5 years in Chicago now.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it when people sort of, like you said, accidentally get into ministry and planting and serving in local churches. Because usually what that means is it didn't start out as some vocational aspiration. It's just a heart
Right.
for the local church and the gospel. And I love that. So with your expertise, and you left a lot out of your bio, but with your expertise and all your many years of experience, I want to ask you to begin an interesting finding in some of Barna's research. In this entire project, so many different questions that we asked folks. And one of the questions was, we asked people, where do they feel the most comfortable having meaningful conversations, things about, family or personal situations, loneliness, depression, anxiety, life goals. And one of the most consistent answers was in a person's home. And then at the same time, when those people were asked, well, what would you do if your church congregation didn't meet in a physical church building anymore, but instead in someone's home? It was actually quite interesting. About 31%, about a third said, I'd feel actually kind of uncomfortable. Another third said, I'd feel kind of uncertain. And then a little less, about a quarter, said, I'd actually feel pretty hopeful about that. So lots of interesting data there, maybe about even what people think the church is supposed to be versus sort of the more intimate spaces and homes and the conversations they have there. So I want to ask you, sort of with that data, big picture, where you are on the front lines of church multiplication and church planting, what are you seeing, especially with newer church plants, in terms of maybe some creative ways that they're thinking about less conventional church gathering spaces?
Yeah, it's interesting because sometimes people can be a contradiction, right? They say, I really want close-knit community. I think that happens best at home. But if you were to call that church for me, it feels a little bit like cultish, right? So sometimes people have a little bit of that contradiction. What we're seeing in terms of like what happened during the pandemic. So let's kind of use the pandemic to frame some of this. We all went to digital and more decentralized expressions of church, church on the lawn, garage. You heard people doing churches in the parking lot. It's very decentralized. And even if churches were kind of like, doing streaming services, people would do watch parties and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
I think a lot of folks who had been doing house churches for a while, in a sense, kind of felt vindicated that, they had been doing something that was legitimate in their eyes, was legitimate, and now everybody else is now doing it with them. But the term microchurch has been something that's been utilized over the last probably 2 decades, but specifically the last 5 to 10 years in North America, because it's sort of an iteration beyond just house church. And others use the term missional community, which has less of a church polity component to it. People can kind of think about it as a more robust small group. But microchurch kind of became this like not a junk drawer term, but it became a more robust term for house church, because when we think of house churches, we think of like the folks that were surveyed on that survey where people are thinking church in homes. But microchurches aren't necessarily just church in homes. Microchurches can be very intentional missionary groups that are trying to engage hard to reach community. So for some, it might be like in my area here in Aurora, it might be the large Hindu temple that's about a mile down the street. And a microchurch might see their vision, their mission is to embed themselves and to reach people in that particular community. Whereas, house church, at least the way that we've seen it in North America during the 70s, 80s, 90s, it's essentially a worship service that was happening in the home. And so mobilization and engagement tend to kind of be the defining factor of what makes a microchurch more than just a worshiping community in the home. It really is about trying to reach people that are most likely never to come into a brick and mortar Sunday gathering. And I would say that the pandemic really put that on the radar for everyone, because I think the term missional community. So think for those listening, you might be familiar with Soma churches or Soma family of churches, different variations of missional communities. It was more of a centralized church that decentralized mission through small groups. So that was kind of the big picture. Microchurches have now actually said, hey, with or without the centralized version of the church, we're gonna exist for the purpose of reaching hard to reach people. And then now you see a little bit of infrastructure come around the microchurches, and sometimes you'll hear the term network of microchurches, and we're starting to see that more and more, and it's very exciting.
Yeah, when you think about church plants in more recent years, maybe especially coming out of the pandemic, and obviously the pandemic didn't just slow, but it shut so many things down. But as we're sort of coming out now, to varying degrees in different geographic locations, are there some of these different expressions of the church, whether it's house or micro, or the more sort of traditional model, we're going to find a location and have a large gathering? Are there any trends there that you're noticing, or is it sort of running the gamut across the board, all sorts of things happening as far as church planting goes?
Yeah, so for those that were doing like launch large type services, so just so you know, Warren Bird just released some of his most recent data around the state of church planting. He did that through the ECFA, which he's the lead researcher. And, he actually showed that over the last 10 to 15 years, we've been using the term launch large, which typically means that, you have a big push to do a large Sunday service that publicly announces, the regular services for a church. In our heads for a long time, we were thinking maybe launch large is about 100, 120, maybe 200 people. And what Bird's survey actually disclosed was that, prior to the pandemic, a large number of churches were using the launch large method, but the average church launch was about 70, 80 people. And regardless of like the actual kind of model. And so, which there's a sociological reason why 70 is like a significant, you tend to have a little bit more momentum. There's a viability and sustainability. And so when the pandemic hit, obviously a lot of folks were not doing that. And so they were doing soft launches, meaning sometimes people were doing kind of like, we're going to launch our small groups first. And then after the pandemic, we launched large. But I think if people realize that, like, I don't know if we're all tired of the term hybrid, but, I think we overused that during the pandemic. But now that we're sort of coming out of the pandemic, people are saying, hey, there's actually something useful about being a hybrid church, not just hybrid digital, not just hybrid, in terms of like, expression of church, but this idea that like, how do we become an agile church? Like, what does church agility look like? And I think that, not to like a majority, but I think there are to varying degrees, those who are planting churches understand agility more after the pandemic than we did prior to the pandemic, if that makes sense. Yeah. So people were committed to a model prior to the pandemic, and they were going to see that through. Over the last year and a half, it really is. I mean, I think really people are kind of like, let's commit to engagement. Let's commit to evangelism. Let's commit to discipleship. And let's be more agile around how the ultimate expression of the church is going to look like.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's one of the gifts that church planting and church planters can offer even more established, larger churches is for them sort of the necessity of missional agility. They have to be agile because of circumstances, but that's a great reminder for all churches and all church leaders, no matter their context, that agility for the sake of missional effectiveness is so important. In an earlier episode, we had with a conversation we had with Tish Harrison Warren, we talked about how some of the research has found that, Christians do find church buildings and cathedrals to be transcendent spaces. But there were also a wide variety of sort of everyday places that people considered transcendent. Things like nature, 72% of people said nature is transcendent, is a transcendent space. They said 58% said space in my own home, specific spaces, or homes in general, 51% said that. So So when we think about sort of the broad spectrum of different geographic locations and environmental settings that people find transcendent, first, what sort of possibilities do these spaces open up for reimagining maybe what meaningful gatherings of the church could look like? And through your experience again with church planters, what have you found? What have you learned from them about the power of gathering spaces, especially as church plants gather in all sorts of unique, I was a part of a church plant where we gathered in a high school cafeteria for many years, which is kind of a common thing. So, yeah, talk about that, about reimagining the power of meaningful gatherings in unique spaces and what we can learn maybe from church planters there.
Yeah, there's probably 20 years ago there was a big push to gather in third spaces, right? And so third spaces would have been much more comfortable spaces. You think about the coffee shop church and definitely the high school cafeterias and gymnasiums and movie theater church, and it wasn't about transcendence, right? Although there was a little bit of kind of a return, like if you think about the emerging church movement, there was a little bit of kind of like, how do we discover the ancient future? And so there was a sense where art and beauty kind of drove how you thought about the aesthetics of space. I think what's really interesting is the iteration of the spiritual but not religious kind of mentality. Because there's a revaluing of like space, right? And so, and a part of that is, a more, I would say this, in the secular sphere, there's almost an embrace of like animistic ideas. When I say animistic, meaning that like, the land is sacred, right? Buildings, the history in the building is sacred. So that's what I mean when I say kind of animistic. And so there's a sense of spirituality that I think is connected to space. And I think Christians who, for a long time, we were thinking about, actually, it's about most, it's about like the third spaces or the public spaces that people are most comfortable, which I don't disagree that we shouldn't plant churches. I think we do plant churches in those spaces. But when you think about redeeming like sacred spaces, what it does is it connects with those who already have a sense of spirituality, even if it's not towards Jesus or the Bible. And what it is you're also tapping into a theology of beauty, a theology of architecture even, and a theology of like what you were saying, like what does the gathering mean? And so it's not just about the singing. It's not just about like the word being taught. Because you think about non-believers, they don't primarily think of like, I want to go somewhere with really good music or really good teaching. Right. So they're asking a sociological question about what is that gathering, what does it represent to the community, and what is that activity that's happening in that gathering? How does that actually translate into the community that we live in? And so they're looking at the gathering, and they're associating that not so much with the content, but with like the consequences of that gathering. And so I think it's important for, existing churches as you're continuing to think about how do we reutilize our space. It's more than just about like, how do we have good coffee or, the dark candles and like the emo music, right?
Yeah.
It really is about like the functionality. Are you hosting in that space like youth leadership programs that are going to develop the children that have the least access to resources, right? And so it's imagining that space, the utility of that space. Yeah. And and I think there is a sacredness that people connect with utility and spirituality. And I think that those that are starting to do that, like in CrossFit communities, I mean, that's a big thing. There's a church in San Diego, they planted in an MMA gym. Again, in their minds, it's utility plus spirituality. It's redeeming the space and it's creating what the gathering is.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a profound thought. You talked about engagement earlier, and it sort of makes me think that same concept applies to space, that rather than thinking about space functionally or thinking about it in terms of experience, we can provide and offer a particular fixed experience that's well curated. Not that that goes away, but to think, how does the space even engage people beyond the 75-minute, sermon and a couple of songs, especially like you said, when we're thinking missionally, evangelistically, that's a profound idea. I think many of us probably residually sort of hold, but to hear you say it is really helpful. That, for the person who's not a Christian, the person who's unchurched, they're not actually primarily asking, oh, is there going to be a good sermon, or are they going to sing the songs that I sort of like? They're asking the question, what consequences does any of this have for my life, my neighborhood, our city, the part of town that we're in? That's so good. Daniel, speak specifically to maybe church planters who are struggling to find a gathering space. That's such a common struggle. Or pastors who maybe have been leading churches for a while, but are still looking for, a permanent gathering space. One, speak encouragement to them, but also two, what are some creative, maybe even subversive ways that they can even begin thinking about the process of seeking a gathering space for their church community?
Yeah, especially in cities like Chicago where public schools they're not yet ready for churches to be back in the schools yet. So it's a big issue. And so some of the first tier countermeasures are, sharing buildings with existing churches, moving services to later in the afternoon. So here is something that the creativity that I'm seeing coming out of the pandemic. And I'm a part of a church plant. We meet in an improv studio, and so during most of the days, the space is used primarily for comedy and entertainment, which I love, and it's fantastic. But a big part of the connection with the space is, in your mind as the church planter. We primarily think of, how do I have a cool building to hold worship services in? When probably the first step that we need to begin asking is, in this community where we like to meet in, where are the places that we can actually have meaningful presence? And that doesn't give you like the space immediately, but I think a part of this is, again, like asking the question, why are they gathering here? Is it just because it's a convenient building? It's a beautiful building. It's a, cheap building. And so when churches and church planners understand why they're committed to a community, and you build those relationships, there is a sense where whatever space is most available to you is going to dictate what kind of church you end up being and the size of church that you're going to be. And so, which is a little bit of a different mindset than the launch large mindset.
Yeah.
So the launch large mindset is, we need 200 people to show up on the first day. We're going to find the venue that fits 200 people, regardless of whether it's in our target, location or not. But if you're a planter from the ground up and you're asking those, in a sense, missionary questions, and that's what they really are. Yeah. So how do we have meaningful presence? And in the midst of establishing meaningful presence, what does it look like for us to gather, in the current infrastructure that's already available to us? Then it actually forces the ethos of the church to be a little bit more embedded into the rhythms of the community, into the shape of the community. If the community that you want to meet in has no large facility, in some ways that's going to dictate like the dynamics of your church. Doesn't mean that you couldn't be a large church. It just means that you're probably going to be a much more decentralized church.
Yeah.
But if you're meeting in a place that has, plenty of large facilities, then, the question probably is more economics. Can you afford it? Is it practical for your usage? And the last thing, Jay, I think one of the things that I think, as we're thinking about this question of space and engagement, I think over the long haul, you may have heard this question before. I don't remember the originator of it. I think I at least heard Tim Keller say it one time, so we can attribute it to him or not. But the question is like, but when you leave, does the community did the community know that you left? Did it matter that you left? And again, that comes down to less about like, how did you utilize a particular space, and has more to do with, did you meaningfully exist in that community? And I think that's really the church planter's primary call as a missionary and a pastor to people, a pastor to a parish or a community, was our presence meaningful? And that, in a lot of ways, I think will dictate size and location.
Yeah. And that's a profound question. I think that all church leaders probably need to continue asking month after month, week after week, maybe day after day. If we left, if we weren't here, would that mean anything to our neighbors, to our neighborhood, to our city? And if the answer is yes, what it would mean is, finally we get this building back or this space back, and they're not, using it up and it just sits dormant for 6 days a week or something. Then I think that should trigger some sort of, man, we've got to really reassess, as you're saying, the sort of meaningful presence we're offering in this space as we invite people into the space. Daniel, I want to ask you sort of big overarching question as we sort of land the plane here. You obviously are on the front lines with so many church leaders and church planters. You're one of the brightest minds when it comes to church planting and multiplication. So big picture question, what do you hope to see for churches of the future? When you think about the churches that'll be planted in the next 10 to 20 years, I'm sure there's hours of conversation that we could have about that. But just in summary, what are one or two of the big high hopes you have as more and more churches are planted in the decades to come?
Yeah, I love it every time somebody asks a question about, like, what's the future of the church look like? And if I could tell you what that looks like, I'd make tons of money, but I'm not a prophet. I work for a nonprofit. I don't make a lot of profit. So, but there are two things, Jay, that are undeniable. These are just facts. These are things that are staring us in the face. Number one is Gen Z is here. So the oldest of Gen Z is 25, 26. They should be filling up our seminaries, our Bible colleges, all of our other leadership pipelines. By all indicators, they aren't to the same degree as previous generations. So in some ways, that should give us a little bit cause of concern and an urgency. Back in the 90s and early 2000s, the median age church planter, this is according to Warren Bird's latest research, was right around 31, 32. Fast forward to 2021, 2022, the median age church planter is 42. So there's something about the way that we tell the story of church planting that is not tracking with, like, the progression of, or the youthfulness of this next age cohort. So what I mean by that is this: if we saw that the kind of like median age kind of hovered around, 35, 36, 37, 38 over the last, few years, I would not be that concerned. But the question is, and I'm not trying to be ageist, but the question is that in 10 years from now, if the median age is 50, are we going to be okay with that? There's something about the way that we tell the story of church planting that isn't resonating. It's not landing with the next generation as much. And that's something that we need to really be thinking through. And then secondly, the other dynamic that is just the reality is what I call the arrival church. Sometimes people call them the global church, but it's the church from outside of North America, and they have come here as immigrants. So 1 in 4 immigrants to the United States is Christian already. And this is really the dynamic that's keeping evangelicals from a steep decline. If you compare it to the mainline Protestant church, we know that there's a steep decline. Part of that is because mainline Protestantism is vastly white. Evangelicalism has seen a surge of immigrant churches. Assemblies of God, which is one of the very few growing denominations year after year. 20 years ago, their white population was 1.8 million. Today, their white population is 1.8 million. All of their growth in the Assemblies of God has been predominantly non-white and immigrant. So that means something. It means something that, Jay, you are, Korean background, you're leading a large church on the West Coast that was not predominantly Korean. That means something. And so the institutional leadership is going to see a replenishment of those who have grown up from outside of North America. And I think that's a positive thing. We used to say that, the nations are coming here so that we could reach the nations. But the nations are also coming here so that they can reach North Americans. And that's what God's doing in the world.
Yeah, man, fascinating stuff, Daniel. I'm so grateful for your work, your mind, your thoughtfulness. I could sit here and talk to you for hours, but want to honor your time. Thank you so much for the gift that you are to the local church, for your belief in the local church and in the gospel. And thank you for your time and the conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Oh man, I could have talked to Daniel for hours about church planting specifically, having planted a church years ago myself, so many challenges, but he had so much great wisdom and insight. Benjamin, I wanted to ask you, Daniel had so many good things to say. I was really in particular intrigued by this sort of encouragement and challenge to all of us who are serving and leading churches, but also specifically church planters, when you go into a city or a neighborhood, to not just think, hey, we're launching a church gathering in a location, but to ask the question, how can we bring about good in this place? How can we serve the common good? Benjamin, you are a church planter. You planted Life Place, and I love even the name of the church. It sort of indicates you want to bring life to this place. And you're actually not just the host of this podcast, but a very innovative thinker when it comes to space and what it means for folks and what space means to a church community. As you reflect back on your church planting experience, how did finding a location, you went through a renovation process as well. How did that sort of process play out in your heart and mind as you thought about working for the good of the city and the community as you were planting a church?
Yeah, I think when I look back over my journey of 13 years of church planting in, a secular environment, we have a stack of wins and successes and also some failures and big lessons learned. And my perspective is that the journey of a church is intrinsically tied to the journey with facilities and buildings. They're connected in a whole range of ways. And I mean, we went through everything from, starting in a golf club, like a clubhouse, to a cinema theater. We were there for almost a year, to like a YMCA style place. We renovated multiple buildings, raised millions of dollars. I mean, went on that whole journey for different seasons. But I'll tell you, 1 year, Jay, so we were running 2 campuses, and one was like an old industrial warehouse in the inner city of Brisbane. And the other was this YMCA kind of space. And in that year, the inner city building, which we owned, flooded. I mean, just a devastating flood.
Yeah.
We rebuilt and remodeled, and 2 weeks after we finished the remodel and moved back in, our other campus burned down. So in the same year, we had a flood and a fire. And so I thought to myself, either we're doing something right and the devil is out to attack us, or somehow we're doing something wrong. God is judging us with a flood and a fire. It feels Old Testament to me.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the facility journey is huge when it comes to church planting, and the narrative that it speaks to the community and to the city, and how we go about building and building community as new churches.
Yeah. Man, that's a whole nother episode there. The flood and the fire episode. We'll have to figure something out there. So many lessons learned, I'm sure. We're so glad all of you are listening and joining us. And again, we're going to continue this conversation on with further episodes, but just want to make sure this entire thing is about resourcing you and helping you as you serve your church. So make sure you go on the website, barna.com/making space, get the journal. And this is a new podcast, as we've been saying. So if you're enjoying it, if you're learning something from it, let us know, share it around with some friends, maybe rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts. That will be a huge, tremendous help to us. Again, thank you so much for being on this journey with us, and we will talk to all of you very, very soon.